Here's a chart of different apple varieties from a grocery store. Who here has a favorite variety of apple? How about tomato? How about squash? Not bad. Did you know there's just as much flavor and texture variation in other fruits and vegetables as in apples? Tonight I'd like to tell you about vegetable diversity and how it's created. New vegetable varieties are developed through plant breeding, which is a process in which people select plants with desired characteristics over multiple generations. Here you can see many different varieties of squash, which were created through plant breeding. My interest in plants started early in my life, since my father is the third generation owner of a neighborhood garden center in Ohio. I grew up next door and was always surrounded by plants, both when I spent time in the greenhouse and in our family's flower and vegetable gardens. I worked at the greenhouse every summer during college and became aware of the new colors of flowers that were available each year. I idly wondered where these new flowers were coming from and how they were created. It wasn't until I started applying to graduate schools, however, that I became aware of plant breeding. I was thrilled that there was a field of study and profession that involved making new and improved plants that people would actually grow. I was immediately hooked and studied plant breeding in graduate school, focusing on spiciness in peppers and fruit quality in winter squash. After graduate school, I moved to Maine to start a new job at Johnny's Selected Seeds at our research farm in Albion. At Johnny's, my job was to take over the squash and pumpkin breeding programs from our founder, Rob Johnston, and plant breeder, Janica Eckert. I inherited many exciting projects to work on, including the one I'm going to tell you about today. I thought it would be helpful to illustrate plant breeding through the story of a single squash, so today I'm going to tell you about a new variety that will be released this fall, Starry Night. A plant breeding project starts when a breeder has a new idea to test out or a problem to solve. In this case, Rob aimed to breed a better tasting acorn squash. He started with 2 different good-tasting squash and cross-pollinated them. Then for the next several years, he identified the best plants, saved the seed from them, and grew that seed the next year. Over about 5 generations, the squash got more and more inbred until they were totally uniform and considered finished. This is the same process that I'm now using to work toward many other breeding goals. All of this work takes place in our field, where we grow about 6 acres of squash and pumpkins every year. And it involves the work of my 2 other squash team members, Emily and Steve, the Johnny's Farm crew, and our summer pollination crew. In order to save true breeding squash seed, it must be hand-pollinated, because otherwise bees will move all sorts of pollen between flowers. We make thousands of hand pollinations every summer in order to make progress on our diverse breeding projects. Each pink flag in this picture marks a plant to be pollinated. In a hand pollination, male and female flowers that are about to open are identified in the afternoon and closed up with a twist tie. That way in the morning, when they open, bees can't get in. We use the male flower like a paintbrush to pollinate the female flower and then cover the female flower with a bag to protect it from bees. At the same time, I collect lots of information on the plants. I take notes on things like how long the vines are, how disease-resistant the plants are, what color and shape the fruit are, and how generally healthy the plants are. All of this data is used to help decide which plants to select for the next generation. Especially in the early generations, many different genes and traits are segregating in the squash, much like traits from 2 parents can segregate in their children. Here's an example of segregation in action. In this case, the parents are segregating for a long vining plant habit versus a compact bush plant habit. Returning to the story of Starry Night. When I started at Johnny's, it was time to start testing the new squash that Rob had created and seeing how it did in different hybrid combinations. Rob had combined it with several of our best parent lines, and it was my job to evaluate all of the resulting squash to see which one might become a new variety. We test many potential new varieties every year. We grow plots of each one and evaluate how they yield, how they look, and how disease resistant they are. It's exciting to see the new the new squash for the first time. In the case of Starry Night, the first year we narrowed down the contenders to the best 2 potential varieties. These 2 potential varieties were grown again the next year, and we collected even more information, such as their plant growing habit and how they lasted in storage. This allowed us to choose our favorite, which at the time was named JWS 14-4082. Another important piece of our process is taste testing, which ensures that we only add great tasting squash to our product line. We taste as many as 700 fruit a year, which means that I hardly ever eat squash at home these days. We rate the sweetness, texture, and overall eating experience of each fruit on a 1 to 9 scale. Once we had picked our favorite, new squash, we had to do even more testing to make sure it was worthy of being commercialized. We worked with growers in Maine and across the country, along with university partners, who all grew our new squash and gave us their feedback. We were excited to see how well it did and decided to add it to the catalog. Now came the fun part, naming the squash. Because of its beautiful speckled appearance, we went with Starry Night. And luckily the name wasn't already taken by another squash variety. This summer, we're producing lots of seed of the squash, and I'm so excited to see it in our catalog this fall and in the fields and gardens of our customers next summer. I've just told you the story of a single squash, but we have dozens of projects going on at once in my breeding program. I have squash and pumpkins at every stage of creation, from just beginning to explore a new idea to the final testing phases. This keeps every day and every season interesting and exciting.